Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from just outside a very sunny Palace of Westminster in central London. Coming up on today's show, Keir Starmer faces mounting questions over the UK's role in European security as leaders meet in Brussels to discuss the €800 billion Rearm Europe plan, with France's Emmanuel Macron warning that Europe must prepare to defend itself. What does this mean for Britain's defence strategy? I'll be discussing all of this and much more with our Downing Street correspondent Simon Pusey. And Nigeria's Foreign Minister Yusuf Tuga has been in London this week, where he outlined Nigeria's evolving foreign policy in a major address at Chatham House. His speech emphasised Nigeria's 4D diplomacy strategy: democracy, development, demography and diaspora, as well as the country's push for economic diplomacy, strategic autonomy and regional stability. Then later, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, a record 1,168 migrants crossed the English Channel in small boats in the first 4 days of March, marking the highest rate of any year on record. According to UK government figures, this brings the total number of arrivals this year to 3,224, reigniting concerns over illegal migration and border security. The surge comes amid tougher immigration policies in the UK. Just last week, the British government introduced new citizenship rules that will make it harder for migrants to qualify for British passports. The policy requires applicants to have lived in the UK for 6 years instead of 5, while also increasing English language requirements. Critics say the new restrictions could disproportionately affect Nigerian and other African immigrants, many of whom rely on work and student visas as pathways to citizenship. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Keir Starmer faces pressure to curb illegal crossings as his government continues negotiations with France to bolster border enforcement. With the summer months approaching, when crossings tend to rise, border authorities are bracing for further increases in arrivals. Elsewhere, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has defended Britain's military contributions, pushing back against comments made by US Vice President JD Vance, who appeared to downplay the UK's role in past conflicts. Speaking during Wednesday's Prime Minister's questions, Starmer highlighted the sacrifice of 642 British soldiers who died in Iraq and Afghanistan, emphasising the UK's unwavering commitment to global security. His remarks were widely seen as a direct rebuke to Vance, whose recent comments questioned the relevance of European allies in military operations.
Tomorrow marks 13 years since 6 young British soldiers were on patrol in Afghanistan when their vehicle was struck by an explosive, tragically killing them all. Sergeant Nigel Coop was 33. Corporal Jake Hartley was 20. Private Anthony Frampton was 20. Private Daniel Wade was 20. Private Daniel Wilford was 21. And Private Christopher Kershaw was just 19, a teenager. Tomorrow also marks the 18th anniversary of the death of Benjamin Reddy, a 22-year-old serving with 42 Commando Royal Marines, killed in Helmand Provost in 2007. These men fought and died for their country, our country. And across the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, 642 individuals died fighting for Britain alongside our allies. Many more were wounded. We will never forget their bravery and their sacrifice. And I know the whole House will join in me in remembering them and all those who serve our country.
Now comes the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Berdal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Divisions between Ukraine and the US only serve Vladimir Putin. President Zelensky is right to try and rebuild his relationship with President Trump. He is keeping a cool head under very difficult circumstances, and I was glad to see President Trump receive his letter positively. What is the Prime Minister doing to help rebuild their relationship after a challenging week?
Minister.
Well, she's absolutely right that we need to do everything we can to ensure that the US, Europe and Ukraine are working together on lasting peace. And I'm doing everything I can to play my part in that, in regular contact with all of the key players at the moment, including talking to President Zelensky yesterday afternoon.
Elsewhere, French President Emmanuel Macron, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and other EU leaders held a high-stakes summit in Brussels on Thursday. The emergency meeting was centred on strengthening European defence capabilities, particularly in response to Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine and concerns about shifting US foreign policy priorities. The summit follows Stamer reaffirming Britain's commitment to NATO and European security cooperation amid calls from Macron for Europe to develop its own defence strategy. EU leaders are discussing the €800 billion Rearm Europe initiative aimed at enhancing military readiness across the continent as uncertainty looms over continued US support for Ukraine. Well, for more analysis, I was earlier joined by our Downing Street correspondent Simon Pusey. Simon, I have missed you. I've missed you, and since the last time we had a political spar, goodness, so Keir Starmer has now become more popular than Elon Musk. Who would have thought, leading the charge? But kind of in all seriousness, I was reading an independent piece this morning, and they were saying that this is the time that Sir Keir Starmer has been able to stand up, and who would have thought it would be in such a crisis? Just talk to me about his role, about defence spending, and basically what's gone on since that explosive scene in the White House last Friday.
Well, political momentum is very important, and it can go either way, can't it? It was only a couple of months ago when we had the Southport stabbings, riots across the UK, people calling for a general election saying Sir Keir Starmer out. Suddenly he's become best friends with Donald Trump, who saw that coming, who had that on their political bingo cards. And he's riding this wave of popularity within the US, but then he's also walking this tightrope about trying to keep Europe together. He's very much on side with Ukraine, being their number one cheerleader along with Emmanuel Macron. So he's all things to all people at the moment. I'm not sure if that can continue. And you can, obviously with Donald Trump around, he can turn on a halfpenny and completely go the other way. So who knows if that bromance is going to continue. But at the moment he seems to be playing it quite well. Obviously with the soft power of the King going over to the Oval Office with a handwritten letter.
Cheesy, but I loved it.
But obviously Donald Trump ate it up. We know that he loves the UK, he loves Scotland in particular. And so he's been given a second state visit, which obviously now people are calling for the King to rescind, which I don't think he will, due to obviously that big explosive spat that we saw in the Oval Office, which was a hard watch.
Really
people
rough.
Talking about it being a setup, and now he's gone even further and taken away aid to Ukraine, taken away intelligence. Whether this is all bluster and whether he's going to put those things back when he gets the minerals deal that he's been looking for, who knows? But
I want to pick up on that point because just here on Wednesday, Sir Keir Starmer quite deliberately, but again, as you said, very carefully corrected J.D. Vance, the Vice President, about those flippant remarks he made about toy soldiers or, referring to British and French troops. How far can the US go without us actually saying, hey, stop it, we're not, balancing now, we're telling you to push back?
I think it's always going to have to be very light touch, isn't it? Because the egos of those two men clearly
to defend our troops?
Massively. Well, I think you have to, when you're talking in public or writing on things like X or talking to them, you have to be very, but then you have to stand up for British interests and you have to stand up for servicemen and families of who've died. And obviously, J.D. Vance, when he's talking, is nearly always talking to MAGA, isn't he? He's talking to his home domestic audience. He's talking about how Europe's done nothing, America's done everything. When in reality, if you look back through history, Europe has stood up so many times for America, and we have gone into war with America and
Afghanistan
not to
and Iraq.
Exactly. So I think with J.D. Vance, he's obviously trying to please Trump, and Trump's doing whatever he wants. But I think when you're referring to those two, if you're standing up in the Commons or if you're writing on X, you have to be very considerate of their views. You can see how.
But is that sustainable in the long term? Constantly fearing not to offend Donald Trump?
Probably isn't. It probably is not. And I think, especially with Trump and the way that he is, you probably do need to go easy in that sense. But you look at every single word that they utter in there or anywhere is under so much scrutiny. I don't actually think the US care too much, really, when it's not in the Oval Office, when it's not in their direct interests, when it's not their cameras, their media are trained on them.
When they're not performing.
I don't think they care so much, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and you can always claw yourself back. You see J.D. Vance called Donald Trump Hitler a couple of years ago.
Yes.
You know, and he's now the vice
All
president.
forgotten.
So it doesn't really matter as long as you do come back and you repent and you kiss the shoes of Donald Trump. You can say anything really. But I think it is quite tough for him to Sir Keir Starmer to keep Europe together, to talk to Canada, for example, speaking to Justin Trudeau, who was over here at the weekend, when you know, Donald Trump has said some terrible things about Canada, calling him Governor Trudeau, talking about it as the 51st state, saying they're going to take it over. And our king is technically the head of the Commonwealth, is the head of that country. It is quite a difficult balance to keep, because then when you don't come out and condemn that, Canadians are rightly going to be furious.
Yes. If we just step back, pull back a little bit, how is this going to affect the UK? There were suggestions that perhaps in the next couple of weeks, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, who's already embattled, is going to be cutting welfare, which is not going to go down well with the public, as we saw with the pension reforms. But do you think this is in response to the threats of what's going to happen with global trade because of Trump? So this is quite serious, isn't it? This isn't just about trying to protect that special relationship and not offending him. This is going to have ripple effects, like the Bank of England governor said this morning.
And welfare, also cutting welfare, that is not something the Labour Party are known for. That is something the Conservative Party are known for. And you could say, well, the country has moved slightly to the right over the last few years, and maybe that won't go too far away to sort of offending the middle ground. But you're right. I mean, the reforms and the things that Donald Trump are doing do have huge effects. You've seen the markets in recent days pulling resources out of Europe. So they're meeting today, European leaders, not just to promise more support for Ukraine and to try and come up with a plan, but more of a longer term thing. How do we defend ourselves? How, you know, Donald Trump made that quip, could you take on a Russian army, to Sir Keir Starmer in the Oval Office? Well, I mean, you know, that was a funny joke.
We wouldn't want to.
But, well, we wouldn't be able to. And also, you know, we're not actually too far away from that, because Donald Trump clearly hates Europe so much. He rails against them in every single...
Yes.
It's something, and it's almost, I think, just...
It's the business, isn't it? It's the business world.
It's the business, but I think
regulation.
ideologically as well, Europe is just not in the same space that, you know, if you're talking about freedom of speech, if you're talking about democracy, which he's continually moving more towards the autocratic side.
We saw that Vance European tour where he tore them to shreds, didn't he?
Which is, you know, interesting on so many different levels.
Yes.
So I think it will have big effects, and you know, some of them may be good for the UK. We're talking about trade deals. Donald Trump surprised everyone by saying that we may be able to do a trade deal with the UK.
Yes.
That is something that we've been trying to do ever since Brexit. That's what we were kind of promised in Brexit, was we're going to get a big trade deal with the US. Whether it would be in our favour, because obviously Donald Trump likes to win at everything, who knows? But we haven't yet had tariffs put on us. And so there are certain things that, you know, our relationship with Donald Trump and the US may have value, and it may add, but also you've got to look at, you know, the markets really do fluctuate when Donald Trump says anything.
That's right, and of course he's had to backtrack on some of those tariffs, hasn't he, because of the results. Very quickly, finally, briefly, I'm sorry you mentioned it, Brexit. There are some people, including a former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, saying, look, this is what happens with Brexit. You know, we decided to leave and we're safe. Is that true? It's kind of the first fair comment you could actually agree with about Brexit.
Well, and I think it's also the first real time that you've started to see that maybe Brexit could have some actual long-term benefits.
That's right.
Because if you're tied to Europe, then
you go down with them.
Well, you go up with them, but you go down with them. At least if you're independent, you have your own choices. It means you have to be incredibly diplomatically smart. I think in the short term and the medium and the long term, trade-wise, we have lost a large chunk of our closest trading partner. It's going to take a long time for that to change. But if you look at security, we're seeing the difficulties that Europe are having at the moment to mobilise, to spend on defence spending, which the UK has always been higher than nearly every country in Europe obviously you've got countries that are closer to Russia that are spending more on defence and have been for a while, but you do start to see the benefits, and you start to see hopefully the US will not. I know, whatever next. Hopefully the US will not turn its back on the UK in terms of security, and hopefully we'll still have that relationship. But it does show that you have more flexibility, don't you? If you get to sort of make your own rules, make your own decisions, and you don't have to go to however many other EU countries to get agreement. But it's a complicated game and it's a difficult game, and I wouldn't be surprised if we start to try and align ourselves trade-wise with Europe more as well, because you do want to claw back a few of those things that we've lost, lose a little bit of the bureaucracy, which we were told we were going to cut, but if anything, it's added more. So, like anything, it's much more complicated than you might have a quote on X.
Complicated? I think so. Simon, it's only been 6 weeks. We've got 4 more years of this. Who knows what can happen in that time?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up on Channel's Business Global, Nigeria's Foreign Minister Yusuf Maitama Tuggar has been in London this week, where he outlined Nigeria's evolving foreign policy in a major address at Chatham House. And I'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. All of this after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from just outside a very sunny Palace of Westminster in central London. In a moment, I'll be sharing highlights from the Chatham House speech of Nigeria's Foreign Minister. Until then, here's a breakdown of some of the biggest business news stories of the week. HSBC has kicked off its search for a new chief executive as incumbent Noel Quinn nears the end of his tenure. Quinn, who steered the bank through the pandemic and a strategic pivot towards Asia, earlier announced plans to step down later this year. The London-based lender, one of the world's largest banks, is seeking a successor to navigate rising geopolitical risks, including the fallout from Trump's tariffs, and to bolster its position in key markets like Hong Kong and Singapore. The board aims to appoint a candidate by mid-2025, with internal and external contenders under consideration. Eurozone inflation eased to 2.4% in February, down from 2.5% in January. This is according to preliminary data released earlier this week. This slight decrease is primarily attributed to stabilizing energy prices, which rose by just 0.2% in February compared to 1.9% at the beginning of the year. Core inflation, excluding energy and food costs, also edged down to 2.6%. Saudi Aramco has announced a significant reduction in its dividend, slashing the payout to $85 billion for the year, down from $124 billion in 2024. The decision, a blow to Saudi Arabia's budget amid Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's ambitious economic diversification plans, follows a 12% drop in 2024 net income to $106.2 billion. With oil prices weakening and Aramco shifting to a net debt position, the cut aims to ease financial strain. Analysts note the move could force Riyadh to increase borrowing to fund its multi-trillion-dollar Vision 2030 agenda, unsettling investors reliant on the oil giant's historically generous dividends. And now to my final story. Nigeria's Foreign Minister Yusuf Maitama Tuggar has completed a high-profile diplomatic visit to the United Kingdom this week, reinforcing Nigeria's foreign policy priorities and advancing bilateral ties with the UK government. The minister held a successful meeting with UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy, continuing discussions initiated during Lammy's visit to Nigeria in November last year. Talks focused on trade, investment, climate, cooperation and security, as both nations work toward a deeper strategic partnership. The minister also delivered a keynote address at Chatham House, one of the world's leading foreign policy institutions. In his speech, he emphasized Nigeria's 4D foreign policy framework: democracy, development, demography and diaspora, which aims to position Nigeria as a more influential and self-reliant global player.
Some of the alarm and uncertainty that we've seen in recent weeks in the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas is already a little familiar to us in Africa in general, and in Nigeria in particular. The existential threat to multilateralism and the rules-based international order, is it really as new as it might seem? Consider the wars in Sudan, Eastern Congo, the Sahel, and beyond. The UN is barely able to manage humanitarian support, still less solutions to end the fighting or prevent the next conflict. We know that clubs are only as good as their members. We've led calls for decades for reform and renewal to meet challenges that are so very different from that which the UN and other international bodies were created. We need to be honest about the rules-based international order. For more and more people, it is working less and less well. Memories may fade, but the response to the COVID-19 pandemic showed that some partners were very much more equal than others. Ever since I was a student, we were told Africa should liberalize markets, privatize, and deregulate. Now those same countries are talking about tariffs and restricting access to markets and capital. It is why Nigeria, to give one example, has expressed our concern over the polarizing implications of the Basel IV regulations and continues to push for reform of the global financial architecture. We know the playing field is not level, and we know the limits of partnership. Every country puts their interests first, but we believe there are many areas where those interests overlap with common interests. We see other countries now making very similar arguments, because sometimes it is still possible to run what Robin Cook called an ethical foreign policy, and at the same time, protect more immediate, tangible national interests. Nigeria contributed to peacekeeping emergencies in the aftermath of independence in the 1960s. To date, I would say we have participated in 61. We supported liberation movements far from our own borders to end the racist regimes in Southern Africa in the 70s and 80s. We helped end the appalling wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone in the 90s. Because of our wealth and our size, we had the capacity to do so. It was also in our interest to do so when it was clear that no one else was going to intervene. The Technical Aid Corps in my ministry sends out volunteers to African, Caribbean, and Pacific nations for free. And yet, we get a lot in return in terms of trust, knowledge, and partnerships. We support efforts to deliver a peaceful settlement in the Middle East through a two-state solution, and we've supported the Palestinian people. We think that is the right thing to do, and we think it is the best way forward. As the debate swings back and forth, and now, at least in some quarters, back again on climate change, we understand only too well the contradictions and the challenges. In Nigeria, we sometimes have droughts and flooding in different parts of the country at the same time. We don't need to wait for future generations. Lake Chad, that used to be a vast inland ocean, is a tiny damp shadow of what it once was. And there are real-world consequences, combined with demographic change. Competition for resources has fueled tensions and violence between herders and farmers in Nigeria and across the region, and fertile ground for violent extremists to exploit a lot of young people with very little in the way of legitimate opportunity. And yet, as everyone in Europe and beyond has learned since 2022, energy security is also national security and an economic security issue and the foundation of a stable international system. Tell a country like Nigeria, which has now finally and painfully abandoned fuel subsidies, something we don't know. Unmanaged, these are some of the most significant triggers for violent extremism and irregular migration. Our problems are everyone's problems. Africa knows that if the transition to a more carbon neutral energy equation is to be effective, there has to be a transition that is fair and equitable.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for you today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.